Hi, this is History with me, Dan. One of the most recently completed new structures in the city of Hartford, Connecticut, is a residential building called the Pennant at North Crossing. It's located just south of Dunkin Park at 1212 Main Street, between Trumbull Street and Morgan Street North. For decades, this site had been a parking lot, but going back almost 100 years ago, this vicinity was densely packed with buildings that housed a variety of businesses. In this video, I'm going to talk about those buildings and some of those businesses, which were called the days of Old Hartford, before the interstate highway plowed right through this section of Main Street. Starting at South Green, Hartford's Main Street follows a generally straight path northward until it crosses over Interstate 84. Then it bends to the northwest as it passes landmarks like Dunkin Park, the old Barnard Brown School, and the Keeney Memorial Tower. At that point, Albany Avenue begins and continues to the northwest, while Main Street branches off to continue heading north towards Windsor. The Pennant building is the first structure on the east side of Main Street, north of the highway. As I mentioned, Dunkin Park is just to the north, and just to the east is the Millennium apartment building that was once a Holiday Inn. The northwestward bend of Main Street has existed from the early days of Hartford. It's shown in this view of the area from the Hartford County map of 1855. As revealed in this section from the 1965 aerial survey of Connecticut, when the interstate highway was built in the early 1960s, much of the area east of Main and north of Morgan Street was demolished, including, of course, the future site of the Pennant at North Crossing. Let's go back to this approximate area of the Pennant as depicted in a section from the 1869 Atlas of Hartford and Tolland counties. Its modern frontage along Main Street doesn't exactly match up with Main Street back then, because in 1929 the street line here was moved northward to accommodate a widening, and because in the 60s the highway and a new north section of Morgan Street clipped the tip of the corner of Main and Village Streets. In the rest of this video, I'll talk about the buildings along Main Street here from Village Street to Trumbull Street. By the mid-19th century, there was a row of commercial buildings here, as shown in this photo taken in the aftermath of the blizzard of 1888. Near the northwest corner of Main and Village Streets was a 3-story brick commercial building that was typical of those built in the early 19th century. North of it was a long row of matching 3.5-story commercial buildings, likely built in the 1840s. North of that row was a much smaller building, and north of that was an Italianate-style house located where Trumbull Street now extends north of Main Street. Beyond that was the old Sigourney House Hotel, which is in the area now occupied by Dunkin Park. I cover this area in another video, which I'll link at the end of this video. Let's jump forward 4 decades to the late 1920s, just before the widening of the street on the north side, a project that would completely transform all of these buildings. Much had changed since the time of the blizzard, but much is still recognizable. A 1-story commercial structure had been erected at the corner of Main and Village Streets. The old 3-story building was still there, and so was the first building in the row of 3.5-story buildings. But the next 4 buildings in the row had been replaced or greatly enlarged. North of these, however, the rest of the row had been less radically altered. Let's travel up this row of buildings as they existed in 1928 and consider the changes that were made for the 1929 street widening. starting with the building on the corner at 1066 to 1068 Main Street. It was erected circa 1900 and seems to have originally been the home, until about 1904, of the Hartford Monumental Stoneworks, a company owned by P.J. Breen, who named this Breen's Corner. Other companies then occupied the building until it was torn down for the street widening. As I mentioned, the building next door at 1072 to 1074 probably dated to the early 19th century. In 1928, it was home to Hoffman Brothers Paint and Wallpaper and the Hoffman Drug Company. 1928 was a presidential election year, and there's a poster for the Democratic candidate Alfred E. Smith hanging on the third floor. This postcard from the 1930s shows that both the corner building, the Hoffman building, and the building at 1078 Main Street were demolished for the street widening. They were replaced by a new single-story building that contained 8 stores. The Hartford Courant newspaper at the time described them as taxpayer stores, erected as an expedient to cover carrying expenses on the property before a final decision was made on what to build. It doesn't seem, though, that anything else was ever built to replace them, so they remained standing until they were finally torn down before the highway came through. Let's turn to the next 4 buildings, which all replaced part of the old commercial row here in the early 20th century. The building at 1080 to 1082 Main Street, designed by architect George Zunner, was erected in 1916 for the New England Fruit and Produce Company. The company was run by partners Oscar Wiener and Hyman Levin. As the Hartford Courant newspaper described it on January 29, 1916, quote, "They have been very successful in the fruit business, in which they handle the wholesale end only. Their business has grown from a few carloads a year to several carloads a week, and upon the completion of the new building expect to handle from 5 to 10 carloads of native and imported fruits and produce. Their working quarters will be on the ground floor, where the offices and loading station will be. The basement will have a modern refrigerating plant for fruits and will have an unique section where green bananas can be artificially ripened. The 3 floors above the street floor will contain lofts where goods can be stored. There is much demand, and this addition to the few lofts in that part of the city will be greatly relished by wholesale houses handling cloth, paper, and hardware, etc." Unquote. Next door, at 1084 to 1086 Main, was the tallest building in the block at 6 stories, built in 1915 for Cadwell and Jones, dealers in seeds, hardware, and fertilizer. The firm had been started at the very same address in 1842 by J. W. Royce. It became J. W. Royce and Company when R. D. Hawley joined as a partner in 1858. After Royce's death in 1860, Hawley conducted the business alone until Samuel F. Cadwell and W. Frank Jones acquired an interest in 1886, and it was then known as R. D. Hawley and Company until his death in 1893, and thereafter it was called Cadwell and Jones. As the Courant described the new building on January 1st, 1916, quote, "The improved facilities will permit of better organization and arrangement and allow the demonstration of farm machinery and implements to advantage. Also, to display in great variety farm hardware, tools, garden and lawn requisites, sprayers for orchard and farm use, poultry supplies, dairy supplies, plows, harrows, cultivators, mowing machines, horse rakes, fodder cutters, In fact, everything used on the farm, garden, and lawn, unquote. The next two buildings at 1088 to 94 Main Street both became connected to the furniture dealer Philip Shore. In about 1910, Philip and his brother Jacob had opened Shore Brothers Furniture at 1152 Main Street on the first floor of the Sigourney House Hotel building, a little further up Main Street, as shown in the picture on the right. After a few years, they moved to 1112 Main, and then, in 1923, the store moved to Trumbull Street. Before then, in 1916, Philip Shore had left the partnership. After a legal squabble over Jacob's continued use of the name Shore Brothers, Philip opened his own store, Philip Shore and Company, in 1918 at 1092 Main Street. To expand his store in 1924, he acquired the adjacent building at 1088 to 1090 Main, which had been built about 3 or 4 years before. In 1926, he retired and sold his business to the Kane Furniture Company, which was the largest chain of furniture stores in New England at the time. In 1927, both Levin's New England Fruit and Produce Company and Cadwell and Jones sent remonstrances to the Street Board in opposition to the widening of Main Street. The project went forward, however, requiring the businesses to cut back their front sections 13 feet. The altered buildings, shown on the right, would continue to stand until they were demolished when the highway came through over 30 years later. Levin's building received a new front designed by architect George Zunner, while Cadwell and Jones maintained their earlier Zunner-designed front in their trimmed-back building. Although Philip Shore had sold his business next door to Kane's Furniture in 1926, he was still an owner of the building. When Cadwell and Jones cut their building back, it exposed a section of the shared party wall with Shore's building. After part of this now unsupported wall collapsed, Shore sent notice that he expected the city to give it proper protection or he would demand reimbursement. Hartford's Building Inspection Department was quoted by the Current as being frankly worried about the danger of further such accidents, and decided to start refusing permits unless property owners on both sides of a party wall did the work at the same time. Eventually, the two halves of Shore's building received a new unified double front designed by architect F.C. Waltz. Other businesses would occupy the space over the next 3 decades, including the City Market, before it became Ruchin's Furniture Showroom in 1957. This was a wholesale firm that went bankrupt in 1961. By that time, Cadwell and Jones next door had long since moved, having sold their building in 1946. Beyond Shore's building, the original row of matching 19th century commercial buildings continued. The 3 buildings at 1098 to 1106 Main Street were demolished and not replaced with anything new. 1098 Main Street had a kosher restaurant on the ground floor called the Commercial in the mid-1920s. This space was later occupied by Freeman's Restaurant. The last tenant in the neighboring building at 1100 to 1102 Main Street was the United Cycle Company, sellers of automobile tires. The company was operated for 20 years by brothers Felix and Dominic Fasano, immigrants from the town of Frosinone in Italy, who, like many others, had protested against the street widening and would now have to close their business. Dominic moved to Providence, Rhode Island, where he helped to found the Imperial Knife Company. Felix opened a new business, the Deluxe Tire Company, on Trumbull Street, but it suffered due to the Depression, and in 1931 he decided to leave Hartford and move to Buenos Aires, Argentina, to join his uncle, who had immigrated there from Italy 54 years earlier. The last of the buildings to be demolished and not replaced was 1106 Main Street, and next to that were two buildings, 1108 to 10 and 1112 to 16 Main Street, occupied by Wilmore's Furniture Store. Earlier, though, the building at 1112 to 16 had been the home of Shore Brothers Furniture, which, as I mentioned, had started in the Sigourney House Hotel building and would later move to Trumbull Street. The altered facade of the building here no doubt dates to 1919, the year of the advertisement on the right, which mentioned their expansion and alteration. At the bottom of the ad is text that advises readers to be sure of the right shore. Is this possibly a reference to the dispute that the store was having at the time with former partner Philip Shore down the street? Remember that this brother was disputing his other brother's use of the name Shore Brothers when he was setting up his own business. The last two buildings of the old commercial row were 1118 to 20 and 1122 to 24, the former of which, on the right, had also become part of Shore Brothers, which had expanded here in the early 1920s before moving to Trumbull Street. The building at 1122 to 24 had had its upper floors altered with new large display windows, likely by the Eastern Cycle Company, which moved in 1912 and expanded into both of these buildings in 1922. The last building occupying the area south of Trumbull Street was the two-story structure at 1130 Main Street, erected in 1925. It was initially used as a branch of the Saucony Burner Company, manufacturers of the Saucony Aero oil burner. But within a few years, it was added to the Eastern Cycle Company's expanded store. For the street widening, this building was cut back and received a new front. The building just north of it would soon be demolished to make way for the extension of Trumbull Street north of Main. This postcard from the 1930s shows the area I've been talking about after the street widening. I already talked about the changes to the buildings from 1066 to 94 Main Street. As I mentioned, the buildings from 1098 to 1106 were demolished. The buildings at 1108 to 16, last occupied by Wilmore's Furniture, were replaced by a single four-story building with a front of yellow brick designed by Berenson and Moses. The same architects also supplied the plans for the new four-story building at 1118 to 20 Main, while the building at 1122 to 24 was cut back 13 feet and given an additional floor and a new facade to plans by F.C. Waltz. Lastly, Waltz also designed the new facade for the building at 1130 Main Street, which was of brick and limestone and had a vestibule entrance finished in marble and tile. Over 3 decades later, all of these buildings were gone, and the area remained empty until the Pennant at North Crossing was built just recently. If you want to know how the rest of this section of Main Street, from Trumbull to Pleasant Street, fared in the wake of the street widening, check out my video on Main Street before Dunkin Park, and remember to subscribe to this channel. Thanks.